You've got thousands of people, all rallying under one banner with a message that goes right back to the founding of America. We're going to break down the No Kings protests, a movement that really swept the nation, and it was all built on one core, really powerful idea. And that idea? It's pretty simple. No one is above the law. That became the central rallying cry for this entire movement, which was aimed squarely at the Trump administration. It was a clear reminder to people in power that, hey, there are limits to your authority. So what exactly were the No Kings protests? Well, they were these nationwide demonstrations against what people saw as a really dangerous expansion of presidential power. And, this wasn't just some flash in the pan. It was actually the third major coordinated protest of its kind since President Trump had taken office. But what was it that drove so many people out into the streets? I mean, what was the actual motivation? Well, it turns out it wasn't just one single thing. It was a whole collection of different issues that fueled this really powerful, multifaceted movement. Okay, so the main concern, and this is the one that gave the protest its name, was this feeling that the rule of law was being violated. Protesters felt like the executive branch was really overstepping its constitutional limits, basically acting without the checks and balances it's supposed to get from Congress. Another huge driver was the administration's hardline immigration policies. People took to the streets to protest deportations that they said were happening without any due process. And what's interesting is that certain areas, like Minnesota, for example, became real focal points for this anger, with huge demonstrations against these crackdowns. And finally, there was this very real fear of war, specifically a potential conflict with Iran that protesters believed was being pushed forward without the necessary authorization from Congress. For them, it was just another glaring example of executive overreach, pushing the country towards a war that had no clear endgame. So we've covered the big issues, right? But a movement is nothing without the actual people behind it. So who were they? Let's hear some voices from the streets to get a better feel for what drove them personally. Take this guy, Richard Rosati. He traveled all the way from New York to Washington, D.C. just to be a part of this. And for him, it went way beyond just policy. It was about fundamental principles, things like honesty, integrity, and how America shows up on the world stage. But for other folks, the motivations were also deeply practical. This quote really captures that economic anxiety that was all tangled up with the political concerns. For a lot of people, the idea of throwing billions more at a new war when the country was already trillions in debt, well, that was just impossible to defend. So you've got this mix of high-minded principles and very real-world practical concerns, and that drew out enormous crowds. But just how big are we talking here? The sheer scale of this single day of action might actually surprise you. Get this. On a single Saturday, there were over 3,000 individual events organized all across the country. Just let that number sink in for a second. The logistics, the passion, the coordination to make that happen, it's absolutely staggering. And these weren't just clustered in a few big cities on the coast either. Nope. The protests spanned all 50 U.S. states. This wasn't just a blue state thing. It was a truly nationwide day of action. I mean, of course you had massive turnouts in the big hubs like Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, but like we saw earlier, places like Minnesota also became these key sites of protest, which really shows you the coast-to-coast, heartland-to-capital reach of this whole movement. So thousands of events, all 50 states, but what was the end game here? Beyond just making noise and holding up signs, what did they actually hope to achieve? Well, it all came down to a question of power. The timing of these protests was no accident at all. With the midterm elections just around the corner, the goal was explicitly political. They wanted to boost Democratic numbers in Congress. The idea was that a reshaped legislature could act as a much stronger check on the president's power, both at home and abroad. And all of this really brings up a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond this one event. When we look at movements like No Kings, it kind of forces us to ask, in a democracy, what is the true power of the people in the streets? How much can a protest really shift the balance of power? That is something worth thinking about.